Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on a simplified biodiversity strategy for your property or farm. I'm Jason McCainch and I work for Macedon Ranges Shire Council in a program called Healthy Landscapes and wish to acknowledge the other funding bodies, which are Hepburn Shire Council, the City of Greater Bendigo, Mount Alexander Shire, as well as Melbourne Water and the Healthy Colburn catchment. Uh, I wish to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm on today, which is the Dja Dja Wurrung, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge their long custodianship of the land on which we're on. And if there's any First Nations person that's joining us today, wish to acknowledge them as well. So I'd start today's session by talking about what is biodiversity. And biodiversity is a diversity of living things within an environment, including the variety of plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms, as well as their genetic differences within species and ecosystems that they form. So in other words, there's species diversity of plants and animals, insects and microbes. And there's also that genetic diversity, which is really important for resilience. And then there's that ecosystem diversity, so forests, grassland, wetlands, and the soil ecosystems. And for some of you, your properties may be over a variety of ecosystems, or it might be just over one. And that's where your EVCs come into it. And why does it matter on your farm or property? Well, healthy biodiversity supports soil health, pollination, clean water and air. You build a resilience to pests and disease, and whatever the climate might throw at you, you can build some resilience to that. And it also, importantly, and not underestimated quite a lot, is biodiversity gives you a stable, productive farm system. But not all, uh, not all biodiversity is good. Um, I was talking with a farmer the other day, and they reeled off that they had deers, foxes, rabbits, pigs, and other things on their farm. And I said, well, that's not all the good biodiversity. So there's some biodiversity that's not good. And we've got weeds and blackberry, gorse, the needle grasses, the Nacella species are just examples of things that may not be as good for your diversity. So when I'm looking at a simplified biodiversity strategy for a property, um, I'm looking at matching it with your goals for that property. So it should be, biodiversity should be integrated into your property. And I'll talk a bit about why and how productivity and biodiversity go together. And it's an important, I think the first step when you're doing a simplified strategy is get an aerial map of your property, mark out where some waterways might be, or where there are fence lines and where there are current remnant trees, or any of those type of things. And then it's about creating a budget. And that budget is not just financial, but also a budget for your time, labour, and the ongoing maintenance of anything that you put in. And then you want to actually plan that in phases. So what am I going to do in year 1, year 2, etc., etc. For me, biodiversity starts from the soil up. So healthy soils retains water and builds resilience. And I often use this slide to just demonstrate that in 1 gram of active soil, teaspoon of soil, there's a billion bacteria, thousands of protozoa, and thousands of fungi. And so every step on a healthy soil has got billions and billions of um, biodiversity, and we only see a fraction of it above the ground or above the soil. So for me, it's looking after soil is where we can start with our biodiversity. And so, how do we start with that? Well, it's about starting with what roots are in the soil. So, we have a diversity of plants that will extract a diversity of nutrients from that soil over different periods. And what that different plants, different depth of roots, the different sizes of their roots, when they're actively growing and not actively growing, is all important for feeding that life in the soil and all that biodiversity in the soil. And then that gets returned. And we can see in this little mock up the fungi, the worms, everything that relies in that soil with these actively growing plants and their depth and their change of what type of roots they are doing. And so you have different roots like tap roots and their depth, and then some roots are nitrogen fixing. So all of that is keeping that soil biology active. And we also want a diversity of plant age, so that some plants are decaying because they've got too old, some plants are actively growing. And then we want that diversity of food above ground, not only for our animals and our livestock, but also for the pollinators and birds and other things that are actively involved in that property. And unfortunately, a lot of the chemicals and sprays that we've used over the last 70 to 80 years have a greater impact on the non-target species than probably on the target species. So sometimes our chemicals and sprays will actually wipe out the insects and fungi that actually have a positive impact on keeping the plants growing and actively growing. And so we've got to be mindful of what we're applying at different times. For me, I like talking about grazing and grazing properties, and shelter, shade and shelter for grazing is critically important. And it's often described as the positioning of trees and having these wide wildlife corridors, and that we have these mixture of plantings, low story, mid story, and high story plants. So your big eucalypts, your lower shrubs, and your grasses. And it was often promoted that these be built in a certain way to slow the wind, provide shelter and shade, and be quite wide. But I think there are more options than this, what's called a wildlife corridor. I think there are options around protecting biodiversity just by having paddock trees, which provide habitat in a different way. And then there's what I call shelter plantings and wildlife pads and silvopastures type plantings. And I'll just go through a couple of these as we move through. So here's sort of this typical paddock trees um, in the landscape, and we've got this typical setup where we've we've excluded by putting a fence up around our paddock tree, and it's just around the drip line of this paddock tree. So it's a fairly limited fence. The benefits of this sort of fence is, and being quite tight around some of our paddock trees, is that kangaroos in particular don't like jumping into this type of tight fencing. I certainly wouldn't, and it doesn't allow the kangaroos to get in there as much. So it's quite good. But what I wanted to point out with this one, hopefully you can see my pointer, is that by having relatively tight around these trees, you've still got access, or your animals have still got access to a lot of the shade and shelter that this tree is providing. So if it was some suggestions I would make to this fence would be, I'd have it slightly longer so that there could be some self-seeding that would be occurring. So a lot of our eucalypts will self-seed, but they don't like that competition directly under their drip line. So if we had this fence extended a bit further, we would have some just natural regeneration of some younger plants, and that would increase our biodiversity because we're increasing the variety of age. So maybe I would keep it tighter across in under here and extend it. So where the most valuable part of this tree from a production point of view is the shade that it's providing. So having them, the animals accessing the shade. The other important part, which I'll talk about a little bit further on, is about the grazing and how long our grazing, if we're managing our grazing well, how long they would be in under that tree, and maybe the resources that have been used to protect that tree might be used better somewhere else. Sorry about that. And then here is a typical sort of setup to start off a tree that started to grow. And on many of our properties, sometimes we'll see trees that'll just start to grow without us planting them, and so putting a cage around them with a few stakes is a good way of doing that. And again, if I was using electric movable fencing, you may use your movable fencing to actually protect that plant by your movable fence, and your electric fence to actually protect it more than just having the cage around it, because a lot of these cages can get damaged by livestock, in particular cattle, so they have to be built fairly strongly. But the other benefit of this type of setup is after 3 or 4 years, you can take this off and move it to another tree that you might want to plant. So that's what I'm talking about, having a variety of ages and resources that you can move and shift to different places. This is a sort of a typical design of a shelter planting. So it's not very wide. It's not that typical 20 or 30 meters wide. It might be 5 or 6 meters wide. And these provide excellent shelter and shade, but it depends on where the sun, wind direction is. And so often are not particularly advantageous if for example, we can see the shade is behind these trees. At the moment, there's no shade in this paddock in the foreground. So it's not providing that shade on this foreground part or this paddock at the foreground. So how do we go about, and it's quite good to have breaks in these shelters, these narrower ones, and then we go on with another shelter. And so having designs where we have a curve in, like this one here, thanks to one of the land care organisations for the photo, we're having this curve in some of our fencing and in our wildlife corridors, in this case, because it's quite wide, allows for animals, depending on the prevailing wind or depending on the shade that is being able to be provided. So building fences that have curves in them is really important. And so how do we do that? Well, we can do that, as this example shows, is that it's following a contour. So the contour is constantly moving. It's not in a straight line across the paddock. And we use what's termed as a hyperspring to keep the tension in this wire. It's not strained overly tight, just strained enough to keep and it's an electric fence so that we can maintain the animals away from our new planting. But again, it gives us different ways that our livestock can access that shade and shelter if they need to. Another example of increasing biodiversity on a property is what I've termed wildlife pads. So these wildlife pads may be existing, or you might just want to plant something out. They might be 5 or 10 metres wide by 20 metres long or something, or they might be like this by connecting 2 remnant trees. And these are very powerful if they're maintained 70 to 100 metres from another link or another biodiversity link. These are really powerful. And again, they're powerful because that provides that shade and shelter for our livestock, but it's also providing that pad for other plants and animals. And if it's not too far apart, we connects with the other wildlife corridor over here for other plants and for other animals to access. And this is where we get benefit from those birds that may be, protecting your grassland from invasion of certain insects or things like that. So again, having that diversity is really important. And then there's this idea of silvopastures where we plant large eucalypts, mainly, and they might be for timber production, having that multi-story, but also the idea that this creates shelter and shade and increases the amount of canopy across the property, but also allows pastures to be grazed through them. So here's an image of one, and here's an actual one. Silvopastures work well with cattle, as you can use fencing, as you can slightly see here in this fencing, to protect those trees. So 1 or 2 electric fences along either side of the fence of the trees to protect those trees from grazing, but also allows the animals to graze very close to the trees, especially at this age, to be able to graze along underneath and graze that pasture. The research on some of these silvopasture type techniques is very limited, but some of it will see that there's this competition zone for nutrients and moisture that's close to these trees. So the trees may outcompete the crop for that moisture and nutrients. But then that sheltered zone, we see an increased amount of pasture and crop because of the shelter that's provided from the trees. And then again, over here we see the competition zone. Now, all of these It's limited research work, but the impact of these trees can be is not fully understood, but it can be marginal in higher rainfall areas, and depending on this distance apart, the effect on this pasture. But also some of the limited amount of research shows that the actual quality of this pasture compared to an open paddock will be better. There's greater diversity. The nutritional value, the feed density of this pasture can be higher in these zones and easily make up for any losses across a paddock that's been incurred by some of these plants, trees and non-graze plants being put in. So not only do we get shade from these trees and shrubs, but we will also get shelter, but we can also get it, and this shade and shelter gives you an advantage in livestock production, but we can also get a livestock production from the grass that's actually being grown in that area. So water. So in a simplified biodiversity plan for your property, we know that better water gives the animals better health and better live weight gain. So here is a photo thanks to a program, Sustainable Farms, that was run by ANU. Here are two photos. These two photos are of a dam on the same property at the same day during the drought in 2019. An unfenced dam, you can see how murky and how unpalatable that would be for the cattle to actually drink. And then this enhanced dam here, and how clear that water is, with just the added features of the plants around it, and the access by stock is limited in this case to this particular area where the car is. So what's really important about this better water is, imagine you going to check your stock one morning and finding most of them dead or dying from drinking poor water as a result of an algal bloom. And it may sound fictional that could happen, but it definitely has happened, where 50 to 100 animals have died as a result of drinking water from a highly contaminated, with mainly just extra nutrients that gives you an algal outbreak that creates a toxin in the water. So in this study that Sustainable Farms did, they looked at 57 dams, 65% of the unfenced dams had chloroform or E. coli levels, for want of a better term, or counts that exceeded the guidelines for water for stock. So 57 dams, 65% of them had chloroform that exceeded the guidelines for livestock. So, but we know that if we give our animals better water, they get better weight gain. And that better weight gain is a result of them having clean water, means that they can go and go and eat more, and that's how they put on more weight. So here's a diagram again, of setting up your dams and allowing them to grow, to get better quality water, trees for the prevailing wind so that we get less evaporation. It's Always better to dry your clothes on a windy, sunny day rather than just a sunny day. The wind creates a greater amount of evaporation. So by reducing the wind and providing shade, we don't lose as much water out of our dams. By making sure we've got this grassy area where the inflows come in, doing all the filtering of and slowing that water down to filter, making sure we don't have any plants or trees on our spillway or dam wall is really important. And for me, it's having some shallows, so having this depth of our dam not consistent is important to allow other animals and plants to grow, but always having this access gate. And why do we need that access gate? Is sometimes we need to crash graze this area. So with these grasses, if they get too long, they start to die out and allow weeds. So we want to be able to graze these areas occasionally to maintain it. But also, if we've got a fire or something that could be impacting us, putting our animals into a dammed area or something like that could be very important to them as well. So making sure we've got an access gate. I'm not a huge fan of having these hard access areas to the dam. I'd much rather fence it off and use a firefighting pump that most farms probably have and should have to pump water up to a tank out of my dam, and then out of that tank feeds this water trough. And the benefits of using water trough is just over a dam is that we get improved water quality. The stock prefer to drink out of it. They drink more water, and therefore they'll go and eat more dry food and feed, and then they gain more weight. So a past utilization can be improved just by having better water. The troughs also, in some cases, allow people to put minerals or bloat oil and other things into the trough, which they couldn't do if they were doing that with dam, for example. So if you needed to increase a particular mineral in your animals, sometimes it's the easiest way to do that is through a water trough system. So, and then, it wouldn't be a presentation from me unless I talk about livestock grazing. And livestock grazing is going to be improving biodiversity. So as you can see on the picture on the right, is that we've got a variety of different ages of and where the grazing has occurred. We've got new growth starting to occur. We've got a bit of old growth starting to break down on the soil surface and some other stuff that's ungrazed. So we have a diversity of ages of plants here. And so that's really important. And the movement of stock, we don't see this 100% utilization. There's always a variety of things being grazed and some being ungrazed, as we can see here. And the movement of stock means that they're not camping under the same tree for weeks and weeks on end. If we go back to one of those paddock trees before, when I said I wouldn't necessarily fence around that tree like that, it's because, in central Victoria, depending on rainfall, it might be, if we're moving our stock all the time, there might be 3 to 5 grazings around that tree for the year. Now, if I'm grazing, moving them all the time, they may only be, a maximum. If there's 3 grazings a year and we like moving our stock, at least every 3 days, that's 9 days that they ate for the entire year that they might be under that paddock tree. And we should be having, again, if we're moving our stock, and we're moving them regularly, we've got over 90% of the pasture at one particular time is in a phase of recovery. And so that's really important to add diversity. So we're adding biodiversity because we have a species are different, grazing also, and grasslands provide that biodiversity for the soil, which creates that feed for the animals and fungi and microbes that are all in that soil. And we have that genetic diversity because we have younger and older plants. The other benefit on farms for these trees, and we've talked about that biodiversity, is there is just an inherent value to it. And we all have witnessed that where we've gone onto a property with a lot of old red grums or something like that. There is a value to that biodiversity. There's also a value for some people in those on the granite to see granite rocks, and then those granite rocks will have biodiversity around them with uh, different lizards and other things that are in that property. So having that diversity is really important. We've talked about how water quality is important in live weight gains, the welfare, in reducing heat stress, but also the wind and chill and cold that can be. So our animals have got a greater welfare outcomes because of the biodiversity that we've planted across the property. And that some of those don't need to be high trees, they can be just shrubs that have been put in. And I've put increased pasture with a question mark because a lot of the data is not, or the research is not there, but I can imagine that we are increasing that, particularly with higher temperatures, where we're slowing down wind speed, we're not getting as much evaporation, and we are, in some cases keeping the temperature of our soils lower by having our by providing shade to our pasture and grasslands. As I just start to wind up, adding biodiversity to your property is it's a marathon, not a sprint. Try stuff. We learn from ours and others' mistakes. So give things a go. Use light fencing and reuse. So you can use light fencing to create a biodiverse corridor or a paddock tree or a wildlife pad. And some of that is just using what I term as the maxi posts rather than a steel post, and use these maxi posts as our corner posts, and we're not making long strains. So, for example, a 10 metre by 20 metre 5-wire fence, around a particular area may only cost us around $300 to put. Use these maxi posts, and after a couple of years, once that wildlife pad has been established, you might be able to pull these up and move them to another wildlife pad. So using lighter fences is really important. Limit your risk by planting over multiple years. I always suggest to start with the easy wins. So start with what you've got, look after what you've got, and then always ask around, because some plant nurseries have better survival rates than others. And if you're going to put the effort of putting in some new plants, you want that to succeed at your end and not be a result of the errors or the way that the way the plants have been matured at a particular nursery. Build on your success. I already said that. And then get an aerial map of your property, as I said right at the start, and have phases of what you create. Finally, landscapes should be changing. There should be young and old, new life and decay. There is a transition phase, like everything, and native plants may not survive in the current soil or rain pattern, or what's currently going on there. So you can use other plants or animals to function in their place until changes occur. Always work with a balance, and there is value to a property by investing time and money into increasing biodiversity. And just finally, I wish to thank various land care groups, Sustainable Farms and ANU, and MLA and Uni Melbourne AgVic for some of the images that I used through this slideshow. It's over to you for any questions. Any comments, any questions? If you want to unmute yourself, please do, or raise your hand and we'll go to it. Go ahead, Brett.
Thanks, Jason. Have you got any thoughts on property maintenance, land maintenance around weeds like blackberry, and doing that with a bit of sensitivity and what can be done? Thanks.
What I'm not quite catching what your question is aiming at.
Oh, it's more around weed control, weed control, but without, using too many harsh chemicals and maintaining biodiversity.
Yeah. So I'm no weed expert at all, but I know what some people are using. So probably the key message with with a lot of our weeds, particularly blackberry, is we've just got to get the biomass down. Now, the first thing is get biomass down. So how do you get the biomass down? Well, there's been some people that'll throw a trough or a cattle lick or something into a patch of blackberry, and the cattle will walk into it and they'll munch it down and stand on it. Other people will use goats. Other people will use a mulcher or something like that to get that biomass down. And then why is that important? Well, it then means that you can use less chemical because you now have an actively growing plant that's smaller. You can use your chemical on that better, or you can get to the access point to cut and paste, which uses a way of getting less chemical but directly into it. So for me, I'm not afraid of using chemicals to get rid of those weeds. You can get away with them in a more natural, not using chemicals, but the workload goes up significantly if you are to do that. So I'm always an advocate for using less rather than none. We can use the technology we have. It's just a matter of limiting the impact on the rest of the biodiversity that's on the property. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, that was good. Thanks, Jason.
Hi, Jason. It's Lewis.
Hello. Yep.
Quick question on the maxi posts. They look like they would be a benefit to some of the fences where I can see the smaller posts aren't working. To get them into the ground, do you need a special post hole driver?
You don't. You can. It's called a big sledgehammer is the first first point of call, but you can buy a petrol operated rammer, or just getting a bigger rammer that fits over the top of the maxi post, and that's probably on your soil that'd be okay. In other soils, you may need a bit bigger rammer, or the petrol driven one to do that. But yeah, they can be put in, and I suggest on your property, they'd be able to be put in just by buying one of the wire post rammers that's big enough to put the maxi post in. The important part with putting them in is understanding where the strain is, and because they're like a wire post, if you put them in the wrong way, you can actually make them look more like an arrow, and therefore they won't last quite as long as if you put the flat side against the tension.
Against the tension, yeah.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
Does make sense. It could be maybe the bucket on your front end loader to get them in.
Yeah, lots of people just use that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like definitely a job for winter when the ground's a bit softer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for the presentation. That's great.
No worries.